perhaps you're new to investing, or maybe you've been investing for the long term and you're looking to add some passive investments to your portfolio. So you might be looking to add ETFs, which are exchange traded funds. Now, as always, I want to share some of the very best ETFs with you in this video. So I'll be sharing an ETF that has 5-year annualized returns for over 23%. I'll also be sharing with you a dividend ETF that has an annual dividend yield of over 7%. Now, don't worry, I'm going to make it very simple for you by breaking them down into lots of different categories. And obviously throughout the video, I'll be sharing some really important information and details on each and every ETF. So the ETF categories that I'll be covering in today's video are All World ETFs, S&P 500 ETFs, Niche and Thematic ETFs, Dividend ETFs, and Emerging Markets ETFs as well. So I'll put timestamps in this video, so if you're particularly interested in a specific type of ETF, then you can simply skip forward, or if you want to watch the whole thing, fantastic. But first of all, I want to start with our most diverse ETF, and that is a FTSE All World ETF. So when you're investing in a FTSE All World ETF, rather than investing in a single stock, say for example Apple or Microsoft, and your returns are relying on the performance of that single stock, with a FTSE All World ETF, you're getting stocks from across the world. In fact, you're getting thousands of different stocks. So there are two big players at the moment that provide two of the very best FTSE All World ETFs, and they are Vanguard and Invesco. So I'm going to share the details of the Vanguard FTSE All World ETF with you first, and then move on to the Invesco one. So the Vanguard FTSE All World has the code VWRP. This is the accumulating ETF. When you look at ETFs, you'll often see they're accumulating or they are income generating. So accumulating ETFs simply means that all of the dividends that are received are reinvested into that ETF, and with an income generating ETF, any dividends are paid out. This is the accumulation version of this ETF. The 1-year returns for this ETF are 16.33%. The 3-year annualized returns, which are those average returns over 3 years, are 11.58%. 5-year annualized returns are 11.96%, and the fees and charges for this ETF are 0.22%. Now the Invesco one is cheaper, which is why I want to share that with you as well. The 3-year standard deviation for Vanguard's FTSE All World is 9.97. Now I'm sharing standard deviation with you because it's an excellent measure of risk. So where all else is the same, what you're looking for with an ETF is a lower standard deviation, because that generally indicates a lower level of risk. So the number of equity holdings within this ETF are 3,629, and your top 3 holdings will come as no surprise. They are Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia. So moving on to our second ETF. Now I wanted to include the Invesco FTSE All World ETF because, as I said, those fees are lower at 0.15%. So you're getting a really diverse all world ETF, but you are getting it at a lower cost. So the code for it is FWRG. It's an accumulating ETF. 1-year returns are 16.62. Now, unfortunately, this ETF was only established in June 2023, so you can't actually see the 3-year and 5-year annualized returns. So if you're someone that wants to be able to see those, then Vanguard might give you the edge and be the better option for you. But if you're comfortable with investing in an ETF that has been established for less than 5 years or 3 years, then the Invesco FTSE All World ETF does have those lower fees. And with investing, there's very little that you can control, but you can control the fees. So if you're looking for lower fees, then the Invesco FTSE All World might be the one for you. The number of equity holdings within this ETF are 2,412, with those top 3 holdings being the usual suspects of Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia. Okay, moving on to our next category now, and that is the S&P 500. So when you invest in an S&P 500 ETF, you are getting those top 500 US stocks within that single ETF. So I am going to be sharing with you 3 different S&P 500 ETFs today. What I will say is the third one is a little bit of a wild card, but it has had slightly stronger performance, so it's worth looking at. So the first one that I want to share with you is the cheapest one, and it is the SPDR S&P 500 ETF. The code for it is SPX5. This is the income generating ETF, and all of these S&P 500 ETFs are the income generating ones, which mean that any dividends will be paid out, usually on a quarterly basis. So the 3-year annualized returns for this ETF are 14.22, 5-year annualized returns are 5.67, and the fees and charges for this ETF are just 0.03%. So the 3-year standard deviation is 11.70, and as I said, where all else is the same, you're looking for a standard deviation that is on the lower side, which would indicate a lower level of risk. I will be sharing with you later in the video some ETFs that have much higher standard deviations, so much higher levels of risk. So hopefully what you're looking for when you take on more risk is more reward, but obviously this isn't always the case, and past returns are not indicative of future returns. So the number of equity holdings within this SPDR S&P 500 is 504. The top are Apple, Microsoft and Nvidia. Now, some people can only invest in Vanguard ETFs because they are using the Vanguard platform, so that is why I wanted to share a Vanguard S&P 500 ETF in here as well. It's the VUSA Income Generating ETF. The code for it is VUSA. 3-year annualized returns are 14.23, 5-year annualized returns are 15.69, and fees and charges are 0.07%. 3-year standard deviation is 11.78, and there's 504 equity holdings as well. Now, the last S&P 500 ETF that I wanted to share with you is a bit more of a wild card. It has had slightly higher performance than the previous two S&P 500 ETFs, and that is because it has been screened for ESG. So this one is the UBS S&P 500 ESG ETF. So ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, which means that the top 500 companies from the US have been screened for those factors, leaving you with just 314 companies in this ETF. So this is an income generating ETF, and as I said, the annualized returns have been slightly higher than a standard S&P 500. So the 3-year annualized returns are 14.42 and the 5-year annualized returns are 16.09%. Now, what I will say is the fees are slightly higher at 0.10%, so you've got 0.03% higher fees than the previous Vanguard S&P 500. However, the performance is slightly higher too. So you've got to really weigh up what you feel most comfortable with investing in. If you're particularly interested in environmental, social and governance issues, this might be one for you. Or if you're keen on that slightly higher performance, this might be one for you. But as I said, as always, past returns are not indicative of future returns, and it will be interesting to see how this ETF performs in the future. Moving swiftly on to niche and thematic ETFs. So I often get a lot of comments and questions in my videos about specific sectors or specific niches. So I wanted to include some ETFs in this category in this video. So I am going to include 6 different ETFs in this category. So the first one is the iShares S&P 500 Information Technology Sector ETF. Many of you will know that I am invested personally in this ETF and have been very happy with the performance. It's done very well over the last few years. So what's happened here is they've taken the S&P 500 and selected the information technology stocks from the S&P 500. So rather than 500 different equity holdings within this ETF, there are currently 70 different equity holdings. So this is an accumulating ETF, and the 3-year annualized returns are 21.70%, and the 5-year annualized returns are a whopping 23.47%. The fees and charges for this ETF are 0.15%, and the 3-year standard deviation is 18.49. Now, you will see here that this 3-year standard deviation is higher. So the higher standard deviation would indicate a higher level of risk. So please be aware of that when investing in any of these ETFs. There are 70 different equity holdings, of which the top 3 are Apple, Microsoft and Nvidia. Now, I often get comments on my videos saying that if you're looking for an information technology sector ETF specifically, then you could look at another version, which is the XLKQ ETF. So I personally am not invested in this ETF because it's not available on my platform, but if you're particularly interested in an S&P 500 information technology sector ETF, it might be worth taking a look at XLKQ as well. But I am personally at the moment invested in IITU. I'm not saying because I'm invested in this ETF you should be too, and you should go away and do it. Your investing needs are going to be very different to mine. Your risk tolerance is going to be different from mine, and your end goals are going to be very different from mine. So please always do your own research and make sure that you're comfortable with any investment that you are making. Okay, so the next ETF is also a tech ETF, but it's actually focused on semiconductors. So it's the Van Eck Semiconductor ETF. The code for it is SMGB. It's an accumulating ETF. 3-year annualized returns are 18.55%, and it hasn't been established for 5 years, so there's no 5-year annualized returns. The fees for this are 0.35%, and the 3-year standard deviation is pretty high at 26.20%. This not being a particularly diverse ETF, so there are only 25 different equity holdings within this ETF. So the top 3 holdings are Broadcom, ASML, and Taiwan Semiconductor. Okay, I'm going to share another technology ETF with you now, but what I will say is I personally prefer to invest in a more broad technology ETF, and the 2 that I'm sharing here are quite specific, but I have had comments of people that are interested in these specific sectors, so I wanted to include them. So this is the LNG Artificial Intelligence ETF. The code for it is AIAG. It's an accumulating ETF, and it has 3-year annualized returns of 15.51%, 5-year annualized returns of 16.85%, fees and charges are 0.49, and the 3-year standard deviation is 22.40. There are 55 equity holdings within this ETF, of which the top 3 are Alibaba, Cloudflare, and Tempest AI. So moving on from those ETFs to a completely different investment. This is actually an ETC, which stands for an exchange traded commodity, but I wanted to include it in this video. So this is a gold ETC. So this is the Invesco Physical Gold ETC. The code for it is SGLN, and this is obviously investing in gold. This is an accumulating ETF. The 3-year annualized returns are really nice and strong at 17.46%. 5-year annualized returns are 12.40%, and the fees and charges are 0.12. So 3-year standard deviation is 12.65, and obviously it contains gold. Okay, so the next ETF that I wanted to share with you is from the energy sector, the iShares S&P 500 Energy Sector ETF. The code for it is IESU. It's an accumulating ETF with 3-year annualized returns of 14.92%, 5-year annualized returns of 16.93%, and fees and charges of 0.15%. The 3-year standard deviation is pretty high at 25.63, and it holds 23 different equity holdings, of which the first 3 are ExxonMobil, Chevron, and ConocoPhillips. And then moving on to a very, very niche ETF, but I thought it was worth including in this video, is the iShares Listed Private Equity ETF. So the code for it is IPRV. This is an income generating ETF, and it has 3-year annualized returns of 13.68%, 5-year annualized returns of 14.12%. Fees and ongoing charges are pretty high at 0.75%. 3-year standard deviation is 19.65, and the number of equity holdings is 70. So this might be an ETF that might be worth considering if you want to diversify your portfolio a little bit, but please do your own research on private equity ETFs. So the top 3 holdings within this ETF are 3i Group Ord, Brookfield Corp, and Blackstone Inc. Okay, our next category is dividend ETFs. So you might be a person who is interested in making an ETF investment where you are paid out dividends. Now, the dividends that are paid out from the ETFs in this video are paid out on a quarterly basis. So I'm going to start with the ETF that had the highest dividend yield, and that is the iShares EM Dividend. So the code for it is SEDY. It has an annual dividend yield of 7.83%, which is pretty high. The only thing that I will say is the performance of this ETF is not as strong. So 3-year annualized returns are 0.13%, and 5-year annualized returns are 1.89%. Fees and charges for this dividend paying ETF are 0.65%. 3-year standard deviation is 13.77, and as I said, that's a good measure of risk. Number of equity holdings are 108, of which the first 3 are Petróleo Brasileiro, China Construction Bank, and Vedanta. As I said, the dividends for this ETF are paid out quarterly. Okay, so the next dividend paying ETF is the iShares UK Dividend. The code for this is IUKD. It has an annual dividend yield of 5.54%, 3-year annualized returns of 6.33%, 5-year annualized returns of 6.61%, and fees and charges of 0.41. 3-year standard deviation is 14.41, and the number of equity holdings is 49, of which the top 3 are HSBC, Rio Tinto, and British American Tobacco. Now, the next dividend paying ETF that I wanted to share with you has a really good balance of quite a good dividend yield, but also really good past performance. So that's why I've included it in this video. It's the Van Eck Morningstar Developed Markets Dividends Leaders. The code for it is TDGB. It has an annual dividend yield of 3.97%. 3-year annualized returns are strong at 15.22%, 5-year annualized returns are 14.05%, Fees and charges are 0.38%, and the 3-year standard deviation is pretty low at 10.69. So the number of equity holdings within this ETF are 100, of which the top 3 are Verizon, HSBC, and Chevron. And then finally moving on to our emerging markets ETFs. So these emerging markets ETFs will include companies from the likes of China, Brazil, and India. So historically, their past performance hasn't been as strong as, say, for example, the S&P 500. But obviously past performance is not indicative of future performance, and potentially these emerging markets ETFs might do well in the future. So I have actually done a separate video which has more emerging markets ETFs in it, which I will link for you. But in this video, I wanted to share with you the kind of cream of the crop and the top 3. So the first one is the SPDR Emerging Markets Small Cap ETF. So the code for it is EMSM. It is an accumulating ETF with 3-year annualized returns of 5.20. 5-year annualized returns are 9.56, and the fees and charges are 0.55. 3-year standard deviation is 11.10, and this ETF has 2,031 equity holdings at present, of which the top 3 are Coforge Limited, Elite Material Co, and Lotes Co. Moving on to our next ETF, that is the Fidelity Emerging Markets Quality Income ETF. The code for it is FEMQ. It has 3-year annualized returns of 2.37 and 5-year annualized returns of 4.68. Fees and charges are 0.5, and the 3-year standard deviation is 13.24. The number of equity holdings is 133, of which the top 3 holdings are Tencent Holdings, HDFC Bank, and Samsung SDS Co. Okay, moving finally on to the very final ETF from this video, and it's the iShares Core MSCI EM ETF. So the code for it is EMIM. It's an accumulating ETF with 3-year annualized returns of 3.54, 5-year annualized returns of 5.13, and fees and charges of 0.18. The 3-year standard deviation is 12.60, and it has 3,199 different equity holdings within this ETF, of which the top 3 are Taiwan Semiconductors, Tencent Holdings, and the Alibaba Group. Thank you so very much for taking the time to watch this video. You've managed to stay with me through all 17 of these top ETFs. I am very, very impressed. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you have a really lovely day. Bye bye.